Now, one of the most common criticisms you're going to hear about the Sony A7IV is that it's a plastic feeling camera and that the camera has no soul. And while I think that those criticisms are a little bit harsh and not completely justified, I do agree the first time I put my hands on this camera, I did notice that it was quite plasticky, and using it does feel a little bit like a cross between creating art and using a computer. But recently I was sent out this little sort of documentary and street photography lens, and just putting this lens on the camera has really totally transformed my experience in using this camera. Now, it doesn't overcome any of the specific shortcomings of the way the camera feels, but using this lens really becomes the dominant experience when using this on the A7IV. And that's because this is a tiny little all-metal lens mount with a manual aperture and a manual focus. It also kind of looks exceptionally cool in my opinion. Now, the thing that probably surprised me most was not just the fact that this totally transformed my experience, but the fact that a lens at this price and a lens at this size would render the image quality that it does. And I will give you a whole sort of host of photos at the end of the video, but right now I think the important things that I want to point out is, first of all, it has little to no vignette whatsoever, which is incredible for this sort of documentary style of photography. You're in a city, you kind of want to be able to see everything properly exposed. The other thing that you will find with this lens is there's almost no distortion whatsoever, which I think is very rare for a full frame 28mm lens, once again, at this price point and particularly at this size. But the reason I'm really making this video is the user experience. The way this makes your Sony A7IV feel more like a vintage or traditional film camera. And that lens does that in a number of ways. The first of all, it's small. It's one of the smallest lenses, or the smallest lens that I've ever used on the Sony A7IV. The second thing is it is a fully manual aperture, manual focus lens, but it has a couple points of difference that you won't necessarily find on all manual focus, manual aperture lenses. The first thing is, with the manual aperture, it does have a very, very short throw. So just with one hand, you can go from f5.6 to f22. Now for me, most of the time with street photography or documentary style photography, I'm gonna be shooting at f5.6 or f8. Couple reasons for this. This tends to be kind of a sweet spot with most lenses as far as sharpness goes. The other thing is, when I'm shooting this style of sort of documentary photography, I'm not trying to blur out that background. I actually want that background to be in focus, because the whole point of this photography is to capture the person or the subject of the image and capture them and how they're relating to the environment in the city. So I kind of want sort of everything in focus. And so anywhere between 5.6 and f11 I find to be very good on this lens. Most of my shots were at either f5.6 or f8. Now, the other thing is, when we have a look at the focus ring on the top, the focus actually has a section that tells you, based on what aperture value you're using, it lets you know what your range of focus is. So for example, if I'm shooting at f8 and I shift this thing over to pointing to, say, 4 feet, or 13 feet or 4 meters, that's telling me that everything from infinity all the way down to sort of about 2 meters, 8 feet is in focus. So when you're using this thing for zone focus, which is a very common way to use lenses like this in a sort of a city or street photography environment, if you know that that thing that you're going to be taking a photo of is somewhere between, 2 meters and infinity away, you just set it to that on the lens and you're able to snap away. And I find that these measurements were very, very accurate. Now, the other thing that is extremely unusual about this lens, and I've never used a lens like this before, is that the manual focus, the actual manual focus ring, or the manual focus throw, is quite narrow. And because of that, there's not actually enough room to put a manual focus ring and get your fingers in there. So what they've done is they have put a little, I guess you would call it a manual focus knob or lever. And this is how you manually focus the lens. You just shift this lever back and forth. The other thing that's quite unique about this lens is it has sort of a 2-speed focusing. So the closer you are focusing to something, the more the focus has to move, or the bigger the focus throw needs to be. And the further away, the slower it needs to be. So this has a very slow focus throw at distance. And then once you get it to about 1 meter or 3 feet, you feel it shift into a close focus mode, and then it moves much quicker at that last little bit. So this just makes sort of focusing a little bit more intuitive, and it makes it a little bit easier to nail focus. Some lenses that don't have this feature are actually geared very well for close focus, but they can be very hard to nail focus when you're further away or focusing on something further away. And other ones have the problem in reverse. So this seems to solve this with like a 2-gear system. It's really kind of a unique thing that I haven't seen in any lens before. Now, when it comes to image quality, the thing I will say about this lens is I was shocked at how good the image quality was at the price point of this lens. I really thought that this was going to be one of these sort of muddy, vintage style feeling character lenses that they call it, with the sort of hazy and not detailed images. It's totally not that at all. It is extremely detailed. There is high contrast. It really feels like a modern lens. It really feels like image quality that you would get out of a $1,000 plus lens. And at no point did I use this lens and wish that I had a different lens on the camera. This thing was really just excellent in all conditions, particularly the fact that there was little to no distortion, which I'll throw a few images on screen now. There is the slightest bit of barrel distortion if you really look for it. But in my case, I found it so sort of a non-issue that I haven't even corrected it. And the other thing is there's virtually no vignetting, which I was shocked about, particularly with lenses of this size. You expect to see vignetting, but there was virtually no vignetting whatsoever. Maybe the slightest bit of darkening at the corners, but even then, I was hard-pressed to see if there was any vignetting. It looked like virtually no vignetting whatsoever to me. Now, are there any negative things about this lens? Well, there's a couple things I'll point out. It's a manual focus, manual aperture lens. I know that isn't for everybody. I love manual focus, manual aperture for street photography because it just makes me feel more in touch with the camera. And once again, it is that component that helps transform this experience on the A7 IV. The other thing is, using this little focus knob at the bottom is unusual and does take a little bit of getting used to. And it might not be great for everyone. So some people might love it, some people might hate it, but it's certainly a completely different experience to any lens that I've ever used before. So that's just another thing to be aware of. The other thing I did find is when shooting sort of with direct backlight, I mean with the full setting sun behind the subject, I did get a fair bit of flare. Now, this was a better performance than just about any of these sort of inexpensive manual focus lenses that I've tested in the past. And I'd say it's on par with a lot of sort of modern, more expensive lenses, but it's also not perfect. But when you do shoot like that, it does give kind of a cool vintage look. So I don't absolutely hate it, but it's just something to be aware of. Now, I'll put a link in the description down below with any details you need and a purchase link. And at the time of shooting this video, I don't have all the details on this lens because it was sent out to me at no cost to myself prior to release. Now, changing your lens is really only one way to change your photography. And if you ever look at your photos and just wonder what's the difference between your photos and the photos that pros get, well, the best tutorial I have ever done on photography, I have just thrown on screen now. And if you watch that video to the end, I virtually guarantee you will be a better photographer at the end of that video than you are right now.